for inviting me to give this talk this evening. From that introduction, it may sound that what I'm actually speaking on today is not necessarily related to my PhD research. You know, on the whole, I tend to work on kind of devotional objects and devotional culture in late medieval London. So this may seem as a bit of diversion from what I'm looking at in my PhD. I hope during the course of this presentation to showcase how the divisions between kind of games, toys and recreational objects and devotional objects are not as strictly defined as we may think. And there is plenty of scope for kind of looking at this area further, looking at these collections of objects. As a bit of an introduction, I wanted to talk a little bit about my MA thesis because during this time, during my MA, I worked on the cult of Thomas Becket in the City of London during the Middle Ages, and I came across a particularly quite well-known source, but is one that is particularly important for understanding the relationship between the cult and the city and how it's kind of emphasised the connections over the Middle Ages, and that is William FitzStephen's late 12th century description of the City of London, which some people in the audience may know of already. This is a particularly important source and quite unique of its time period. It comes from around 1173, 1174, and is a preface to his life of St. Thomas Becket, who had recently been martyred at Canterbury Cathedral. The cult of Becket explodes in this kind of period of the late 12th century, and its connections to London are quite profound because St. Thomas Becket was born in London, his parents were Londoners, and he served as Chancellor of the Exchequer before he became Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, there are lots of details concerning kind of the topography, the layout of the City of London, which are really fascinating in FitzStephen's account, but some of the details he describes are really about kind of growing up and the kind of recreational culture of the city in this time period. And this is where we can kind of begin to connect some of the objects from the collection of the Museum of London here. Firstly, he describes games on ice during the winter months, in particular skating on the ice at Moorfield, just outside the walls of the medieval City of London. And he says that when the Great Marsh that laps up against the northern walls of the city is frozen, large numbers of the younger crowd go there to play about on the ice. And he kind of describes how this works. And he says that others are more skilled at frolicking on the ice. They equip each of their feet with an animal shin bone, attaching it to the underside of their footwear. Now, this is an area where we actually do have, amazingly, surviving evidence of this kind of practice, which is this wonderful kind of shin bone kind of ice skate, which you can see on the left of the slide here. And this is from around the contemporary time period for FitzStephen's account. It was found actually at Moorfield, and is kind of an indication kind of already where these texts and where these material objects actually can meet and tell us kind of what people were getting up to during their leisure time during this period. And this kind of got me thinking about what other sources, you know, are there out there, what other material objects in the collections of the Museum of London are there for looking at this aspect of material culture and material culture and medieval life, and so an aspect of medieval life that isn't always brought to the forefront of considerations about the Middle Ages, and I think can tell us something really, really interesting about a kind of a broader understanding of life and leisure and recreation, and something that applies across kind of a societal level that isn't just limited to the richest elites in society or people with huge amounts of money to be able to spend on them. We're looking at, and what my presentation wants to focus on in particular, are kind of the more modest aspects of this cultural output. So that was kind of a starting point when I was working on my MA dissertation. Another aspect of FitzStephen's account is he describes the medieval game of football as it was played during the Middle Ages. So this would have been played by kind of large crowds rather than the standard kind of 11-a-side that we may have today. And again, we have examples of this form being depicted, not from the collections of the Museum of London, but these are misericords, so sort of kind of seatlets in the aisles of Gloucester Cathedral. And these are from around kind of the 14th century and show on the left two kind of youth figures playing, and there is a ball between them. I hope you can see my cursor on my screen. So this is kind of an aspect where representations of these games are known from contemporary sources. And this provides us kind of evidence of seasonal games, a combination of physical activity and sport, and sometimes these games could actually be quite dangerous. The game of football was at one point banned, or the papacy tried to ban it because it was seen as provoking social and civic unrest, particularly in kind of urban population centres like London. And one particular example which I really like is the description of water jousting on the River Thames. And FitzStephen describes that at Easter they hold games of a sort of naval tournament, a shield being securely fastened to a mast fixed mid-river, a young man standing in the prow of a small boat, propelled by the current and by several rowers. And you can see a depiction of this. There are several depictions of this in kind of 14th century manuscripts, the one here coming from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and it shows this sort of this event of a team of rowers propelling kind of a boat with a young man stood at the back of the boat with a kind of spear with a sort of target fixed in the middle of what looks to be a river. And it's important to note actually that water jousting is a game that has kind of quite long trajectories. Water jousting is a game that's still played in certain areas of southern France and is quite a prominent civic event in some of these kind of towns in southern France where it's played. So I think it's important to see some of these recreational activities as something that are familiar to us and do have a provenance which is relevant to this day. But this got me thinking more broadly about an aspect which I've always been fascinated about since kind of very early on in my undergraduate degree, and that is the scholarship around childhood in the Middle Ages. What, you know, kind of childhood as a phenomenon, thinking about the scholarship from very early stages, the scholarship from the 1960s, 1970s by people like Philippe Ariès, which has kind of moved gradually since then. And there are kind of various ways we can talk about childhood in the Middle Ages. A lot of the debate has been around where the precise boundaries concerning children, adolescence, and adulthood actually are. And it's important to note that they often aren't particularly hard and fast. It's very much dependent on geography, context. Kind of the legal status is sometimes varies depending on where you are. A general rule of thumb that quite often inheritance, for instance, as far as inheritance and kind of landowning goes, 16 is around the age by which that is commonly considered in this area. And on the screen, I wanted to show kind of three developments kind of in the last 20, 30 years that have tried to look at medieval childhood in various forms. There's the book by Barbara Hannawalt about growing up in medieval London, which is a very kind of story-driven narrative about and discusses growing up in medieval London. Nicholas Orme's wonderful book on medieval children, which has a huge kind of plethora of evidence gathered into it. And I also wanted to look at this from an archaeological perspective. So looking at the book on the right, Medieval Childhood Archaeological Approaches, has some excellent articles about, and I wanted to link this into what I've just talked about, this idea of play, this idea of recreation, and where can we find this in surviving material culture? Because for instance, in Barbara Hannawalt's book, there are very few references to toys and things, objects of play. It's very much more about the social conditions. There's more about that in Nicholas Orme's book, for instance, but I think it's an area that has been somewhat underdeveloped in the scholarship. And looking at the collections of the Museum of London, you get to find kind of these amazing examples of objects which have kind of connections to ideas of play and ideas of recreation. So I wanted to bring up this image, and I think it's significant that both Hannah Walt's book and Orm's book feature this image on the cover, because I think this is one of the most visually kind of stunning images. It's around the end of the Middle Ages, but it's Peter Bruegel's children's games, which depicts over 100 examples of the sorts of games that children may play over this time period. And it's an amazing kind of sequence and tapestry of kind of life that that you can kind of see all sorts of various things going on in the background. Kind of the more you look, the more you find. And I highly recommend Wikimedia, and they've done some various art projects to digitize this painting. You can zoom up really, really closely to kind of the individual parts of the painting to get a closer look. But you can see, for instance, a boy with a hobby horse in the bottom kind of middle where my cursor is on the screen, and he's got a stick in his hand. And one thing I did want to point out, kind of going into this, when talking about objects of play and recreation, and particularly linking it to childhood, one thing I wanted to make explicit early on, and something that is somewhat of a can be a kind of a stumbling block for me just as a pure research point, is obviously the tendency of children to make toys out of things regardless of whether they were designed to be toys or not. I think using their imagination, I don't want to draw too rigid boundaries around this, because I don't think it would reflect kind of the practice, how people use these objects, and how they were perceived at the time. So I think, and thinking about variety, I think is hugely important here, which is what this picture indicates. It indicates a huge variety of activities and objects which children and young people could engage with. And I think that's something that I wanted to think about specifically. Now, the Museum of London has quite an astonishing collection of toy and miniature objects, particularly kind of metal pewter work objects. These very cheap mold cast were documented and published in 2005 by Hazel Forsyth and Jeff Egan at the Museum of London. And it's quite an astonishing collection that they have there. My personal favourite is this on the left, this mounted toy knight figure that's from the end of the 13th, the start of the 14th century. And you can see kind of it's indicative of the arms and armour potentially used at the time. It's kind of freestanding. They're quite small. You can see it actually in the collections of the Museum of London. It's on display in the medieval gallery. And the first time I went to the museum, I actually missed it because it's so small. It's not a large object, so it's quite easy to miss. But I highly recommend it. It's an amazing thing, and that it survived is amazing in and of itself. And what also is quite staggering are the kind of varieties of different kind of toys and recreational objects. So you have mounted figures and knights. You have kind of miniature household objects, things like jugs and ewers and pitchers, plates, dishes. And actually what happens is that these become more frequent as you go through the Middle Ages. A lot of these come from the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. This really takes off as far as numerically our survival kind of record goes. But I wanted to think about this kind of idea of the archaeology of childhood because the surviving material evidence, again, indicates this kind of demand, but also this variety in terms of how these objects are produced. They're quite easy to make. They can be made in minutes through kind of 2-3 piece molds. There is some connection, and I want to talk about this a little bit more in a few seconds, to some of the pilgrimage objects, which you may be familiar with from the Middle Ages, kind of themselves, the cheap mold cast kind of badges, statuettes, figurines, and various other kinds of objects. So I think one thing, and it's been a joy to work on these objects, that's to kind of look at this and find a repository of sources that haven't really been looked at in this way. And what I want to try and do is break down some of the typological boundaries between these different, and I shall explain this as I go through the kind of the next few slides. So One thing I noticed when looking at a lot of the pilgrimage objects is that, and objects that are associated with pilgrimage, one theory I'm working through at the moment is some of these objects which have often been associated with pilgrimage may not actually necessarily have to be bought by pilgrims or at pilgrimage shrines, or they could have been bought in urban centres like London, for instance. But some very and the Museum of London has a huge repository of pilgrimage-related objects. I mean, it's quite stunning how many of these survive. In terms of wider European contexts, there is a wonderful database called Cunera, which has around 20,000 objects in its collection. These kind of pilgrimage-related materials are some of the most fortuitously surviving, and in terms of their frequency, in terms of their number, they're kind of one of the largest collections of medieval objects, really. A lot of these kind of statuette or figurine objects, which I'm looking at here, which is a freestanding figurine of Thomas Becket, who I mentioned at the start of my talk. His cult really is a huge contributor to these types of objects. And a lot of the Becket, the objects that we have surviving in the Museum of London are attributed to Becket. And one thing I would also like to look at in the future with my research is should we attribute all these objects to Thomas Becket? Why are we attributing all these objects to necessarily one singular cult? So you have, for instance, these wonderful figurines, this figurine of a bishop, for instance, which has been attributed to the cult of Becket. And these are from almost exactly the same time as the figure of the toy knight, which I mentioned in my last slide. So one thing I'm also thinking about is how these objects are made. These are made in very similar ways through kind of hollow cast metal production. This object, if you look at it, it looks like it has a nail hole in it. Some of these statues or figurines would have been freestanding, but some of them, we think that they may have been nailed to kind of little sticks and wands and kind of been brandished about. The traditional theory was that they may have been placed atop walking staffs. And you get this kind of wonderful three-dimensional sense of, you get to see the back of a bishop, which you don't, it's something interesting in of itself, this kind of three-dimensional nature of these objects. I also wanted to reference this work by Brian Spencer, who of course worked for the Museum of London for such a long period of time, and was really kind of a huge authority on a lot of these pilgrimage objects. His book on this is still an incredible resource. It's really a catalogue of the collections of the Museum of London in this area and the finds from London. One of the amazing things with a lot of these objects is we have very strong sense of archaeological provenance. So we know that they came from either the Thames foreshore or archaeological dig sites along the riverfront, or from kind of wider London sites, though particularly prominent along the riverfront and the foreshore of the River Thames. So this huge profusion of objects in the 13th, but particularly 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries is something really, really fascinating. And one example of this is objects kind of connected to the senses, and I think and connected to kind of, and looking back, connecting these to childhood, I think the most kind of prominent example of these is these wonderful rattles, which we have several examples of in the Museum of London's collection. And these are late medieval examples from around 14th, 15th century. And they are again kind of open work, lead and tin, mainly kind of examples. They have a kind of, I think you can just about see it. It's got a sort of small metal kind of acorn in the middle of it, which is kind of the rattling component. Again, one thing that made me think about in the relationship to possible objects of childhood is their size. This is kind of, it's 8 centimeters tall, which is difficult to give a sense of scale here, but I think these are kind of objects which would be the sort of right size for kind of children to brandish. And we know from artwork from particularly the Low Countries that these rattles were a prominent form of kind of childhood related objects that particularly small children would be given. I have the wonderful Canterbury bells, which you can see an example of in the middle, are another really frequent example of a sort of pilgrimage related object. And they come from mainly the 14th, 15th centuries as well. They come in, one of the interesting things about these objects is they vary heavily in size. Some of them are really, really quite large, and some of them almost tiny. And I think another aspect of this, and something that I want to emphasize throughout this talk, is the kind of variety, both in size, in quality of kind of the material, in quality of the aesthetic design. And they seem to have been produced, some of them to a very high kind of quality. And it brings in further questions of how expensive would these things have been to buy. Who would have been selling them? Where have they been? Where would they have been sold? And I hope kind of over the next few slides to provide some more information on that for some of these types of these objects, not necessarily related to pilgrimage, but things like rattles and toys and other things, I think have some strong contexts kind of continentally that I'd like to talk about. And you get kind of the sounds and of these kind of objects in medieval London. I think it's a really interesting idea to think about these sensorially. There's a wonderful account of a reformist who is on trial for heresy in the early 15th century, and he has a particular problem with the Canterbury pilgrimage, which is still very popular at this time. And he describes the pilgrims who come back from Canterbury wearing these bells as great janglers, kind of making noise and causing kind of irritation to the locals as they pass through. So I think kind of seeing this in a wider context of play, but also in terms of touch, in terms of sound, and also sight, kind of the sense aspect of these objects is hugely important. And we kind of can see how some of the importances and the uses of these objects can change over time, and to see kind of objects that wouldn't be possibly made for a more devotional context turning into objects of play. And this comes across very strongly in a miracle of the late 15th century from around 1480. One of the most popular cults at this time was the new cult of Henry VI, who, after his death in kind of around 1470, his cult kind of sprung up and was particularly popular in places like London. His shrine at, he was moved to St George's Chapel in Windsor, where there was a particularly prominent cult site, and it's a place where a lot of miracles were recorded at the kind of the back end of the 15th century, around 1480, 1490, 1500. And what's nice about some of these miracles is actually we get geographic locations, we can track some of these people. But one particular example I want to talk about is the miracle of Miles Freebridge, which is a miracle which describes a young boy, is about 6 months old, from Aldermanbury in London, and he is being carried in the arms of an older boy, just kind of being carried around, and he's obviously he's either teething or he's just having a bit of a, he's just being a bit of a nuisance or what have you, and the older boy, as a way to try and placate him, gives him a badge with the bust of Thomas Becket on it, to kind of play with, and you can see this, an object that was bought as an object related to pilgrimage is now being given to a small child as an object of play, as a plaything, or as just something to hold on to. And what happens is he accidentally swallows it. And the miracle is that his father comes along, and through great duress and various calls to kind of the Virgin Mary and Henry VI, he eventually spits out the badge, and he's taken by his parents to the shrine at Windsor, where where his parents give this offending badge, the offending item, to the custodians of the shrine at St George's Chapel in Windsor. And you can see, therefore, the way this object changes, the significance of this object changes over time. It goes from being an object related to pilgrimage to an object used and played with by a child, and then an object which is given as a votive offering to another shrine by the boy's parents. And I think thinking about how these objects, their significances and their usage change over time throughout their kind of what you could maybe call lifespan, or their kind of the idea of an object biography is something that that was kind of discussed very prominently in the 1980s and 90s, and is still quite prominent in material culture studies today, creating biographies of these objects. And kind of tracking their use and the changes in their identity over time. Another example of this and how kind of toys and devotional objects could be related, and this was a point that Nicholas Orme made in his book, was that votive dolls, for instance, could be in some ways related to children's toys. There's a wonderful example from Exeter Cathedral, which has been digitized and is in a three-dimensional format, so you can actually look at it in 3D. There could be some connections here that this is quite a complex and a multifaceted subject, and I think it's something where definitely more research will be needed. And I want to think about this going the other way as well. So objects of play or recreation being converted into objects of devotional significance. So this is a wonderful example of a 14th century chessboard, which has been converted into a gospel binding. It was from a German context, and some of the squares have been removed, and kind of in it have been placed to what is a true cross relic in the middle, and kind of various depictive scenes around the site, including, I think if you can see in the bottom middle, two people actually seated playing chess. So I want to think about this in two ways, that this is a continuum where objects can move in multiple directions in terms of how they are used and how significant they are. I think what's important to note here is obviously the symbolic nature of chess as a game, its representation of kind of medieval social hierarchies and secular structures, and this kind of symbolic conversion of such a representation of kind of lay life into a devotional religious object, I think is highly significant. You also see chess pieces occasionally being affixed to reliquaries. I also think what's important here, and this has been noted by others who worked on this, including Philip Corday, who's worked recently on this, is that also the preciousness of the materials. This is a this is very high-end object. This is made of kind of red jasper and various other kind of gilded materials, and so this is not kind of so it makes it perhaps more suitable to be converted into a reliquary because it's already of a level of material preciousness, which I think is interesting to think about as well. Now, I want to quickly, in the last, in the next sort of 10, 15 minutes, think about the wider connections, wider geographic connections. And I want to start by looking at these pipe clay figurines, because these are often, these are known to have been made and produced in the Low Countries, in Flanders, in kind of modern day Belgium, and were exported through the Low Countries into London during the later Middle Ages, where we have various surviving examples. So the two on the left, for instance, are two pipe clay figurines depicting Mary holding the infant Jesus. And on the right is an example that I wanted to produce as a comparison. I apologise for the slightly grainy photo of a mounted knight on horseback, which I think is an interesting comparison to the earlier example. I think looking at these things across a long durée, across several hundred years, I think it will be really interesting going forward. But looking at where can we find these objects, how are they being imported, who is importing them, and then who is selling them, once they arrive in London, for instance. It's important to note that these are much later. These are from the end of the 15th century, and they coincide with a wider, huge kind of increase in the numbers of these sort of cheap, devotional and wider kind of objects kind of flowing into London during the later Middle Ages, particularly in the 14th and 15th century, and particularly from the Low Countries and the Hanseatic League, so sort of northern Germany and lower Denmark. And you can find examples of toys being imported into London through looking at the customs records of the City of London. There are two main types that I've used so far in my research. So the petty customs of the City of London and the tonnage and poundage accounts. These two accounts are kind of forms of taxation which are levied in the later Middle Ages. Their revenue goes to the Crown. They are, in these cases, they are taxes on kind of goods and usually based around kind of average values. So it's usually something like 4p on the pound per pound of cargo, effectively. And you can see kind of examples, and I'm still looking through this, and I'm still kind of, this is still something I'm looking at, imports of kind of these objects in quite large numbers from what looks to be the Low Countries, going by the contextual inventories of these cargoes, the people who are importing them. So you see, for example, the top one is 60 dozen ball cups, which I think, which it had been suggested to be the little kind of ball cup games that that are still popular today. An example from the 1480 petty customs accounts describe one box with toys. And a particularly large example from 1514 describes one basket containing 2 dozen gross. So 2 dozen obviously is 24, one gross is 144. So sorry, yeah, so it's 24 by 144, so rather pleasing number of 3,456. So this is a huge quantity as well. This is the other thing that I wanted to stress, that from what I've looked at the customs records so far, is that some of these objects are coming in quite large shipments. And kind of things like rattles. You can see the description of 16,000 tennis balls, for instance, from 1534, the 1534 accounts. And another example, 1,200 trifles pro pueris, which is sort of trifles for children or trifles for boys, 18th September 1537. And you can kind of see these kind of large numbers of objects kind of floating in. And this kind of made me think, well, who is, where is the demand coming from? Who is buying these in? Who is importing them, and who is selling them on? I think it's highly likely that the prominence of London at this time as a conduit of trade for the rest of the country is highly influential here. I don't think all of these 3,456 rattles would have been sold in London. If so, basically you would end up with some of these records of everybody in London having or every child in London pretty much having a rattle by the time you would. So I think one of the important things is that these would be retailed, and they would be passed around, kind of traded onwards into the wider country. One, and I apologise, this is quite large, this section, but I wanted to give an indication of the sort of contextual of what these sort of merchants were importing. This is a sort of cargo that is very indicative of a lot of merchant cargoes of this time period, containing a kind of a huge variety of goods, but a particular variety that you can detect patterns in the more you see them. So this is a cargo of Robert Soper, who's an indigenous merchant, i.e. that he's a Londoner. And this is from the 16th of June 1514. And what seems to have been done here, that it's collected all the cargoes that he has in various ships on this date. So it describes kind of one sack of hemp, crossbow strings, red laces, parchment skins, brushes, depictive and painted cloths. And I wanted to draw these up because some of these seem to be various types of devotional objects which are also being imported from the Low Countries. So these sort of depictive cloths quite often have religious figures and devotional significance. He also imports things like one basket with rattles, for instance, which I've stupidly not put in bold, but you can see in the kind of and you can see this kind of huge variety of goods, but they seem to have a connection in that they tend to be things like dress accessories, small kind of objects of thread, leather bags, kind of personal objects, things like combs, needles, as the rattles, as we said before, as I said before, and so then it also gets me thinking, well, is there a type of merchant who would have been selling this in late medieval London? I think there is, and I think this is prime territory for a haberdasher. So haberdashers were kind of, they developed out the mercery trade, the cloth trade, kind of selling bits and bobs and kind of threads. And I apologise if this hasn't come up very large, but I think it kind of brings in a lot of what I've just been talking about, of these objects being bought and then seemingly sold together. So it describes here a huge kind of array of things like caps, and also the source describes children's caps, which are red and blue, and kind of various bits of paper and purses, and one wooden gaming table with a set of men. So what seems to be a chessboard, seemingly with the figures. And this is in an inventory or a description of wares in a haberdasher's shop from 1378. It also describes kind of a large quantity or a variety of rosary beads or paternosters. So one set of beads of jet, one other set of beads of black alabaster, wood, one other children's objects, for instance, such as one pair of children's boots of white woolen cloth. So when looking at these kind of shipments, you can see in this haberdasher's inventory, it's kind of uncanny, really, the connection between a lot of these objects and the inventories in this haberdasher's shop. It also describes a wooden whistle, so the kind of the noise-making objects, and also he describes one cloth painted with him crucified and other figures, so the devotional cloth kind of that I mentioned earlier. So I think this is really something that I want to look at more and want to work about. And to kind of, what I'm trying to do here is really try and get into how these objects are represented in the documentary evidence that we have for late medieval London. And I'm finding kind of more and more all the time. And I wanted to try and find an individual example of a London haberdasher buying this stuff. And we do actually have examples of this. There's a legislatory move in the 1430s and 1440s to try and regulate and restrict imports by merchants from the continent. So a particular legislation that is passed is called the Views of Alien Hosts, where merchants, particularly from the continent, would have to be hosted by a London merchant so they could sell their goods. And this was an attempt to try and regulate the trade going on and it was a protectionist kind of move by the City of London, really at the insistence of some of the lead guilds to try and regulate kind of internal trade. And what we have here is the case of John Malvern, or where John Malvern, who is a London haberdasher who comes up in the customs records at various points in the 1440s and 1450s. He seems to be quite a prominent haberdasher. He's also a merchant that works overseas. He also is a merchant at Calais, which is a really important English trading post at this time period. And what this shows is there's this wonderful kind of seemingly a relationship that he has with a merchant from the continent, or from what is known as an alien merchant. So a guy called Arnold Henriksen, who appears various times. And it says that the first day, the 14th of January 1441, Malvern buys 10 dozen purses, 20 dozen games of chance. Now these are called, they're referenced in the actual documents as what are called quarter spells, which nobody's really been able to work out what this actually means. It's thought to be some sort of game of chance. They come up time and time again in the customs records in the 14th and early 15th centuries. He also describes checkerboards, which I think are in this instance more to do with accounting rather than chess. But you can see again this kind of this variety of goods, that you have a London merchant kind of buying this. Haberdashers tend to be retailing merchants, which means that they tend to buy their produce and sell it on rather than make it themselves. And that the rise of the haberdashers, they're a company on the rise in this period, that it provokes quite a lot of discontent amongst other craft guilds who try and get various imports banned in the 1460s and 1480s because they feel that their trade is basically being kind of decreased by these haberdashers who are just importing tons of stuff from the continent and selling it on potentially cheaper than they can manage to make it themselves. And this kind of brings me to my last point that I want to make before I wrap up. And it brings me to another image from the 16th century from a Low Countries context, which is this image by Peter Etz, and looking at a pilgrimage, a kind of a pilgrimage scene to St. Anthony. And it's kind of what I'm really interested in is this section in the middle, which if we zoom in is some sort of pilgrimage stall. And what you can see here is how some of these objects may have been displayed. Again, this was from around 1550. And sometimes I've been asked kind of, well, do you think these Low Countries images are relevant for looking at an English or a kind of a London context? And I think with the rate at which Low Countries objects are being imported into London, it definitely is, and this is a really relevant way of looking at these objects. So you can see a kind of array of vaguely devotional figures. You can see sort of crucifixes and figurines here on the bottom, but you can also see toy windmills, a hobby horse, some toy drums, and some toy crossbows. So one thing I would like to kind of think about, as we move, and I want to just kind of end with as we move to the questions, is that also that these objects were probably sold side by side as well. That kind of toys, devotional objects, you're really looking at quite a broad continuum of objects that move, their significances move in terms of who sells them and who's making them, but also their uses change once people buy them. And I think that's something I'm really looking forward to kind of tracking more in the documentary evidence that we have for these objects. And one thing that's really struck me from looking at the customs records is just how much evidence we have for a lot of the objects, which when I started my PhD, I couldn't have imagined that there's so much. These customs accounts have recently been kind of edited and published by Stuart Jenks and the Hanseatic History Association, and a really amazing resource. They count something like 38, 39 volumes at the moment, and are all freely accessible. And I've provided a link to the website by which you can access them in the handout, because I think they are such an amazing resource and so massive that it's going to be years before we kind of work out what are the true significances of what these records are telling us. But I think I wanted to start by looking at some of them today, and I think I'll probably stop there.